to use the term consciousness to refer to phenomenal consciousness, unless otherwise noted. So just to not save some syllables. I'm also a panpsychist of the dual aspect or resilient sort. I think that's the only kind of panpsychism that's kind of worth considering. So I will also use the term panpsychism to refer to dual aspect or resilient panpsychism. In a few minutes, I'll say more about what that is. So panpsychism by itself says that consciousness is everywhere, but I don't think it says that everything is conscious. I think it's better defined as the view that everything is either conscious or made of conscious parts, or itself part of a greater conscious whole. So that means that a table or a chair, for instance, might not have its own consciousness, but it might be made of particles that are all conscious. Is the sound good, by the way? It's not too loud or anything. Okay, good. Right, that will come up a little bit later. And then if you say you're a dual aspect or resilient panpsychist, you add that the reason why consciousness is everywhere in this sense is that consciousness is the intrinsic nature of the physical world, which if you look at physics, then physics presents the physical world as purely relational. And conscious experience are kind of the relata of the relations presented by physics. More on this later as well. So my basic view on illusionism is that it's just obviously false. Consciousness is a datum, or phenomenal consciousness is datum. It's just like present right here, and I can't deny it. It's just indubitable. But recently, of course, illusionism has gotten more and more attention, and a number of philosophers have argued that the thing I think is obvious is just doesn't exist. And as a realist, and in particular a non-physicalist realist, I think of this kind of as a positive development, because as Napoleon allegedly said, never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. And the enemy in this case is the physicalist. So from a certain perspective, what I mean is that illusionists can be seen as doing non-physicalists and especially panpsychists a favor. So first we have, for instance, Keith Frankish, who argues that physicalism collapses into illusionism. And I think maybe François kind of supported the same thing today, if kind of saying that phenomenal concepts are intrinsically or implicitly problematic. Yeah, so one way to spell it out is just to say that, well, any physicalistically acceptable concept of consciousness will have to leave out features that, according to the phenomenal realist, will be essential. Realists, of course, tend to take this as a reductio in support of non-physicalism rather than an argument for illusionism. So Galen Strawson, for instance, is one who has argued to this effect, at least for the same implication, but you know, with a modus tollens instead of modus ponens. Keith has also argued that realism implies, or at least strongly suggests, panpsychism. I think this is not a reductio at all or anything near it, because panpsychism is not obviously false. And François has argued that the illusion of phenomenal properties, the illusion is extremely robust. It's very unlikely to go away, which to me just supports this Cartesian point that consciousness is indubitable. But of course, illusionists see it the other way around. They, you know, think of the first argument as not a reductio, the second as not a reductio, and think you can feel certain without being right. And so it seems that realists and illusionists are kind of stuck in a stalemate where realists say, I just know I'm phenomenally conscious. We represent this by Descartes. Either you're say, I'm just absolutely certain my credence is 1, so nothing can conceivably move me. I don't know what it means for that to be false, or at least you can say I'm more certain about this than anything else. So my credence is super high, so nothing can move me significantly. But then you have illusionists who said, well, you can feel certain psychologically, but be mistaken. And there are serious problems with realism that should move you, right? So my question for this talk is, how should we proceed from here? Is this just like a clash of intuitions and everyone's going to stick to their own view? Or is there anything we can do to kind of move the debate. And I'm gonna consider a few things that have been suggested in recent literature about what should move the realist. So Frankish and François suggest that if the illusionist could provide a solution to the illusion problem, then the problem of explaining why we have the illusion of consciousness without kind of appealing to consciousness being real, that should count in favor of illusionism. Keith has also made a point in a recent paper that came out last year that realism undermines consciousness science, and realists should want the science of consciousness and therefore maybe be illusionist, because then they can have consciousness in the non-phenomenal sense as science of that. And Keith has also argued that not only does realism lead to or support panpsychism, panpsychism leads to something called universalism. So that's the view that not only do tables and chairs and artifacts like that have to have their own sort of unified consciousness. After all, it can't just say they're made of conscious part, but any kind of arbitrary collection of stuff has to be conscious of, like the chair and have like 1 liter of air around it, or maybe even disjoint objects of this table and that door, but nothing in between, you know? And that's like worse than panpsychism by itself. I'm going to argue that points 1 and 2 here won't really move the debate because they're already incorporated in it. It's like it connects to a cost that the realists have kind of already paid. So it won't change things to get this point out again. And we'll say that realism might lead to panpsychism, but not universalism. What should move the illusionist then? Well, there's, of course, if you had the perfect solution to the exclusion problem, that's the main problem of non-physicalism. And if illusionists are right that realism kind of implies, that physicalism implies illusionism, then non-physicalism is the only kind of realism we should consider. So that's the well-known trilemma between epiphenomenalism, overdetermination, and violation of causal closure. So if you can solve this problem, then why not be a realist or a non-physicalist about consciousness? Well, so as we'll return to, Russellian panpsychists, they claim to have solved this problem. And however, Russellian panpsychism faces what's known as the combination problem. So if you could sort of accept the panpsychist solution to the exclusion problem and solve the combination problem, then that should also help. Okay, I'm going to briefly sketch my own solution to the exclusion problem, which is a version of panpsychism called phenomenal powers panpsychism, which I think secures mental causation a bit more robustly than standard panpsychism. As for the combination problem, I will just touch on this in the discussion of universalism. But otherwise, that's a topic for another day. But Bill Seeger and myself have worked on a view called the fusion view about mental combination, which we think take care of a lot of the issues here. But yeah, just to flag that. But that's not something I'm going to talk about. Okay. So first, the illusion problem. That's the first thing that illusionists could use to move the debate. So the illusion problem is like the illusionist counterpart to the hard problem, which basically asks, why are we conscious, or why does phenomenal consciousness accompany any physical processes? This problem, of course, presupposes that we are phenomenally conscious, so illusionists can't accept it, but they can instead try and answer the question, why do we have the illusion of consciousness? Why do we think we have phenomenal consciousness, even though we actually don't? And it has been claimed that just as if a realist theory is able to solve the hard problem, that will count strongly in favor of it, then if an illusionist theory can solve the illusion problem, that will count in favor of it. But why is that exactly? How does a solution to the illusion problem support illusionism? Well, firstly, it undermines what might be seen as a central argument for realism, namely that if consciousness appears to exist, or if we can't help thinking that phenomenal consciousness exists, then the best explanation of that is that it really exists. But, you know, the illusion problem, the solution that would give a different explanation. or it could even like be deduced from the appearance that it must exist, but that won't be the case if we have a solution to the illusion problem. It's also an even stronger point is that they support a debunking argument, which says that if our belief in consciousness is explained by something else than consciousness itself, then our belief in consciousness is unjustified. Those are related arguments. I'm going to focus on the second one. So I think the illusion problem connects very interestingly to the principle of physical causal closure that I mentioned as part of the exclusion problem. So the principle of physical causal closure, PCC, says that every physical event that has a cause, so then we exclude random quantum events, but if a physical event has a cause, then it has a completely physical cause. So this includes all events in the human brain and body. They have a complete physical explanation. And yeah, that of course threatens to show that if consciousness is not itself physical, it can't have physical effects and must be epiphenomenal. But I think also the principle of physical causal closure by itself implies that there has to be a solution to the illusion problem, because the illusion problem says, okay, we believe in consciousness, or we have an alleged illusion of consciousness, and that is construed as a physical event, right? Or at least physically realized event, the functional property that is physically realized. And it follows straightforwardly from the principle of physical causal closure then that this belief must have a physical cause, right? So every physical event that has a cause has a sufficient physical cause. Belief is in consciousness, we assume it's a physical event. Okay, it has and it's not random. Okay, it has a physical cause. So this is something we kind of already know if we accept this principle. And realists, of course, already acknowledge this challenge from the principle of physical causal closure. It's an essential part of the exclusion problem, which is, widely acknowledged as the main problem of the view. And all the main positions, they accept some sort of consequence of this, either epiphenomenalism or overdetermination, if you are a certain kind of dualist, or you accept panpsychism, which we'll return to later, accept how that will help, or you can just, if you're an interactionist, say that, okay, I don't really accept this principle and pay the cost. So, from this perspective, it's how could the solution to the illusion problem really move the debate if we already absorbed this principle? So I have been told after I kind of planned the talk that Philip Goff has made a similar point. So I just want to acknowledge that this might not be like, I'm sure there are many people who can think of this. You might object, though, that, a solution to the illusion problem would support this debunking argument. But if you just look at the principle of physical causal closure in other ways, then that would not support it. So sort of a solution to the illusion problem points out a consequence of physical causal closure that's usually not noticed. So yeah, David Chalmers pointed this out to me as an objection. So so the point is that if you look at the exclusion problem, according to this problem, physical causal closure kind of implies that on the typical version that consciousness is epiphenomenal or maybe an overdeterminer. But according to the debunking argument, if we have a solution to the illusion problem, which is implied by physical causal closure, but this is not always noticed, then we get the result that belief in consciousness is unjustified. And if belief in consciousness is unjustified, then we might as well conclude that consciousness doesn't exist. So that's like way worse than it being epiphenomenal. Right. So that's, I think, maybe how illusionists look at it. But but it still follows that you don't actually have to solve the illusion problem. You can just point out that realists are already committed to a solution. So kind of it comes back to the principle of physical causal closure anyway. So in response to this kind of objection that it will make a difference in this way, I think realists should just appeal to this notion of acquaintance, that you don't have to be causally affected by your own consciousness as a non-physical thing, or at least if you're a non-physicalist realist, in order to know about it or have justified beliefs about it. You can know about it in a different non-causal way via acquaintance. To be acquainted with something is to know it by sort of being the thing you know about, or by having the property you know about, rather than being causally affected by it. And this idea that we can know at least phenomenal properties or properties related to our own consciousness by acquaintance, that's a fairly standard assumption among realists, at least non-physicalist realists. So it's also standard response to this kind of problem. Okay. So this is going to be like a little bit long chain of discussion here. But illusionists could then raise an objection to acquaintance, which, well, before I present that, I'm just gonna go through these two theories. The causal theory of knowledge says that knowledge of X, whatever, requires being causally affected by X, and maybe in virtue of the X-ness of X, not in virtue of something else. That's required for knowing about something. The acquaintance theory says that at least for some things, such as phenomenal states, you can know of them, not by being causally affected by them, but by sort of being phenomenally conscious or by having phenomenal properties. So there's more of a direct relation, not an intermediate causal relation. And Keith raises an objection to this acquaintance view that's in connection with discussion of panpsychism. He says, how can we be sensitive to the intrinsic nature of things? So if, so this is in the passage where he discusses panpsychism, which says that, okay, we are, that claims phenomenal properties are intrinsic. We can be sure that our brains do not contain mechanisms that are sensitive to the intrinsic nature of their own states. So what he's basically saying here, I think, is that the causal theory doesn't work for intrinsic natures, and in the context, phenomenal properties are these intrinsic natures. But why don't we just turn to acquaintance then, if the causal theory doesn't work? When it comes to acquaintance, he raises the objection, or the rhetorical question, how could simply being something be sufficient for anything remotely like awareness or knowledge? How could a thing gain insight into its own nature simply by existing? So here, I think what they're saying is that acquaintance is just like deeply mysterious and nonsensical. And if you have to posit this to explain how you can have knowledge of consciousness, then, you might as well conclude that you don't really have knowledge of consciousness. So I think this is an objection to like realism or non-physicalist realism in its own right. If you need acquaintance to know phenomenal properties on that view, then that's bad, and it also undermines this acquaintance response to the debunking argument. Okay, so I wanted to try and respond to this. So yeah, maybe this is a bit of a speculative argument, but it's something I thought of. So I think you could argue that causal knowledge is, knowledge that follows this causal theory of knowledge, it kind of presupposes knowledge by acquaintance, or that you can know something by being something. Okay, so here is how I would defend that. Just one second. So if you accept the causal theory of knowledge, then you can ask the question, like, if you can ask this about acquaintance, how can possibly being something be sufficient for knowing it? You can ask the same thing about the causal theory. How does being causally affected by X enable knowledge of X? How does that work? And I think the intuitive answer that most people kind of accept is that, or if you don't reflect too much, why this kind of makes sense is that, well, if X causally affects you, then something changed in you, and you have direct access to yourself, and you can know that change, and from that infer what happened with the thing that affected you, right? So if something affects you, it changes you, and what you primarily notice is how you changed, and from that you infer what the other thing did, what happened in the other thing to change you. And if that's how it works, then you need acquaintance to notice the change in yourself. You need to be able to just know something because, you know, it's your own property. So that's like a step in this process of knowing something by being causally affected. Well, there are some other ways of looking at it. You might say, no, I actually know the change in myself by not directly, but being causally affected by it. So something affects me, that changes me. I notice that by being affected by the change. But that's just gonna create an infinitely regress, because to know how you affected yourself, you must like affect yourself again and so on and so on. So you're just gonna get stuck in an infinite regress where you never kind of actually absorb the knowledge, because you have to just keep affecting yourself infinitely. So then there's this other alternative that you don't know X via the change it produces in you, but just directly, if you are causally affected by something, then you have direct access to that thing, not like mediated by what changes it creates in you. But I think this is way more mysterious than acquaintance with yourself or your own properties. That's like a kind of clairvoyance or remote viewing of the thing that is causally affects you. So that's just like, if you want to argue about what is mysterious, then I think, you know, yeah, this will be at least as mysterious. And yeah, when you discuss things at this level, everything becomes mysterious, and acquaintance is no worse than the causal theory. Okay, I'm sure there's a debate in some area of epistemology of how this works that I should know about, but you know, this is as far as I've gotten in this. Okay, so that's mostly what I wanted to say about the illusion problem. A solution is implied by physical causal closure, and so that's a cost that kind of already been absorbed. And if there's any extra costs by the debunking argument that's kind of follows from a solution to the illusion problem, then you can take care of that by acquaintance, which is not that objectionable. And again, also something that's already widely presupposed. So then the next point is that if you're a realist, then that will undermine consciousness science. So here's my reconstruction of Keith's argument to this effect. So the first premise is roughly that phenomenal properties are not publicly observable. If they exist, they're kind of private. You can only know them from your own perspective, nor are they conceptually linked to anything publicly observable, such as psychological properties understood in a functional way, or behavior, or anything like that. It's conceptually possible to have any phenomenal states without any particular publicly observable property, or vice versa. And then the next premise is that something that's not publicly observable nor conceptually linked to anything publicly observable can't be studied scientifically. And phenomenal properties then, if real, can't be studied scientifically. And so then Keith says, panpsychists deprive themselves of any experimental purchase on the chief problem they face. Of course, this doesn't show that panpsychism is false, but it looks like a dead end for anyone who hopes for a panpsychist science of consciousness. Yeah, so this argument is directed against panpsychism in particular, but from how I've reconstructed the argument here, it would apply to anyone, other kinds of realism, or at least non-physicalism as well, that will think that consciousness is not publicly observable or conceptually linked to it. Okay, yeah, doesn't show that panpsychism or non-physicalism, maybe realism is false, but it should kind of push us towards, motivate us towards considering other options at least, and take them seriously. My response to this is that, well, this argument, to respond to this argument, we should consider the history of consciousness science, because research on consciousness used to be entirely taboo. So here's a quote from Bernard Bars, who goes through this, or some of the history. Psychologists avoided consciousness for most of the 20th century. The central topic in psychological science became taboo. Those with serious interest in risked professional suicide. So this is how it was for a long time. And why is that? Well, that was largely because consciousness was regarded as not publicly observable and therefore not scientific. So here's a quote from Watson, like the father of behaviorism, who was behaviorism, of course, like is the core of this whole tendency. No one has ever touched a soul or seen one in a test tube. Consciousness is just as improvable, as unapproachable as the old concept of the soul. The behaviorist must exclude from his scientific vocabulary all subjective terms, such as sensation, perception, image, desire, purpose, and even thinking and emotion as they were subjectively defined. So I interpret this as, okay, if you define these things functionally, maybe it'll be fine, but if you define them subjectively, then they are not publicly observable and they're not part of science. So we should not research this. That's such like bad science to even be concerned with consciousness in the sort of subjective sense or any of the subjective phenomena. And so behaviorism and analytic functionalism and various views that are quite eliminativist about phenomenal consciousness dominated until the 1990s. But what happened in the 1990s? Well, not that they tried to show that consciousness is publicly observable after all. At least I don't think that was the main event. What happened was that people rejected this strict standard of public observability. So one big part of the revival of consciousness science was the NCC research program, the search for the neural correlates of consciousness, where you try to just find correlations between physical states and conscious states without assuming anything about the ultimate metaphysical basis for those correlations. And as Chalmers, for instance, has, at least I think quite convincingly showed, and I think many NCC researchers agree, is that this kind of research must be based on these pre-experimental bridge principles that says, okay, this observable phenomenon is linked to consciousness, and then we can link that observable phenomenon again to some physical neural state. How do we get these principles? Well, yeah, according to Chalmers, we get them based on philosophical reasoning, not the sort of deductive sort where you have a conceptual analysis that says consciousness is nothing more than a function, but more like less deductive philosophical reasoning, and also from your own first person perspective. Yeah, so as Chalmers says, they involve a leap of faith. These principles are not deductive. So yeah, so, consciousness science as we know it just arose from, rejecting this public observability standard. So I think insisting on public observability is what really undermines consciousness science, not realism about the phenomenal. At least if we're talking about consciousness science of a non-behaviorist or non-analytic functionalist sort, which I think is what realists should care about anyway. Okay. How much time do I have? Do I have like 15 or 20 minutes? Okay. Okay. All right. I'll just go through this. No, I think I'll skip this and I'd rather have some extra time. No, I'll do it. Okay. So as I mentioned, Chalmers says that these pre-experimental bridge principles are based on like philosophical reasoning, but also first-person data. So at least you can observe consciousness in your own case, and then you can verify correlations between your own physical states and your own conscious states, and then you can, that gives you something to go on when you want to find more general correlations that also hold for others. But yeah, Keith, who's now the target of a lot of this, I hope that's okay, has an objection to this methodology. So you might think an experimenter could get around this problem that consciousness is not publicly observable by making themselves the subject, lying in the brain scanner and observing correlations in real time between their experiences and the scanner. But the same problem arises. The experimenter would have to respond psychologically, instantiate various functional states to their own phenomenal states, noticing they are in certain phenomenal states, deciding to correlate the state with the scanner's image, holding the relevant information in the working memory, and so on. And the neural states detected by the scanner may be the neural basis for these psychological responses rather than the phenomenal states themselves. So we can kind of disentangle your own phenomenal states from psychological states that are instantiated at the same time. So this won't give you any reliable data that you can use to create correlations for consciousness science. Well, I want to respond to this. It seems possible, despite this problem, which is a real problem, it seems possible to disentangle phenomenal and psychological, understand its functional states, because you can just observe, you can put yourself in the scanner and you can put yourself in the same phenomenal state, but with different psychological, in different psychological settings. So you can be like, okay, I'm gonna immediately report while I'm talking the phenomenal states, I'm gonna report it later, I'm gonna try to actively introspect, I'm gonna try and not actively introspect, or you can even do studies, it's like complicated, but you can compare a person dreaming and someone who is awake, and they can have the same redness, for instance, like dream a color and then the color when you're awake. So you can try to kind of, it's not always easy, but there are methods for trying to, get the same phenomenal states in very different psychological settings. And if some physical state remains constant while the psychological states vary, then that could be the correlate of the phenomenal state. And if there's some psychological state that just can't be entangled by the phenomenal state, then maybe, that psychological state, depending on what it is, of course, but could be sort of a higher level correlate. So I think, this is definitely a methodological problem, but it doesn't totally undermine the first person as a source of data. Okay. Now for the third point that you might want to use to change the debate. Well, first, you argue that realism leads to panpsychism. We'll get to how all this works. And as if that's not enough, so that maybe used to work, but in the last 5, 10, 15 years, there are, panpsychism has become quite popular, so you can't just use that reductive anymore. A lot of philosophers defend it. So you might argue that, well, panpsychism leads to universalism, which is a really implausible view, much more so than panpsychism alone. And you really, want to avoid this implausible consequence. That's more implausible than illusionism. Okay, so how does realism lead to panpsychism? So the idea is that if you're realist, you have to accept the hard problem. There's something you have to explain. Why does phenomenal consciousness accompany at least some physical states? And panpsychism seems to be the best solution. At least this is what I think, and I interpret Keith as kind of thinking the same thing, but suggesting that, if you want to be a realist, you should be a panpsychist, because this is then a good way of fitting consciousness into the physical world. So what panpsychism, again, Russellian panpsychism says, is that all physical properties, if you look at what physics says about them, if we understand physical properties as those properties that are exhaustively described by physics, they're all purely structural or relational, or maybe dispositional. So physics tells us how things relate to other things, not how they are in themselves. So for instance, physics says everything is made of particles, such as quarks and electrons. What's an electron? It has a certain mass and charge. But what's charge? Well, that's just to attract particles with the opposite charge and repel those with the same charge. That's just a way of relating to other particles. What's mass? That's, if you want to simplify a bit and do the Newtonian version, it's just to resist acceleration. So that's like how you move or don't move, and attract other things, and so on. So that's also just a way of relating to other things. And that's the way it goes with all physical properties. The next point is that these structural or dispositional properties need intrinsic realizers. You can't just have relations without relata, structure without anything that has the structure. It can't be structure all the way down. Or at least that's an intuitive point that most are inclined to accept, at least unless they think it is panpsychism. We'll get back to how to accept, why accept it. And then phenomenal properties seem to be intrinsic. We know what they are like in themselves, not just how they relate to other things. You can know what it's like to see red without knowing any of the other colors, for instance, how it relates to them, because you've only seen red. So therefore, you can just fit phenomenal properties into the physical world by saying these properties are the intrinsically realizers of everything physical. They're the relata of all the physical relations. They're sort of the stuff that has the structure. Yeah, so this elegantly integrates consciousness into the physical world, and it also gives a solution to the exclusion problem, because if you say phenomenal properties are the intrinsic realizers of the physical, they play a very important, indeed essential role in the physical world. They're not redundant at all. Okay, but then panpsychism gets the combination problem. How? So, you know, this argument kind of explains how consciousness in general, the consciousness of particles, fits into the physical world. But what about our consciousness? How and also when does the micro consciousness that we think would have to belong to particles and stuff like that combine to form this complex and unified consciousness or macro consciousness that we have, or clearly have? It's a realist would say, like, that we obviously have. Well, obviously this happens in human brains and animal brains. If you're a panpsychist, I don't think it's implausible to say that it happens in at least plant cells, maybe molecules or atoms, all these like unified or self-organized physical systems. But why not also in tables and chairs or rocks or these like entirely arbitrary aggregates? So universalism just says that every portion of reality, collection of particles or whatever, has unified consciousness. There is combination absolutely everywhere. Does panpsychism lead to universalism? So Philip Goff, famous panpsychist, has claimed that the most elegant answer to when is there combination is always or never. We know that never is not the right answer because there's must be combination here in our own minds, brains. So then we should go with always. At least Keith cites this point from Goff. And he also claims that universalism has a good claim to be the default view of combination for panpsychists. And then he also adds that universalism is highly implausible. It's as far as you can get from the common sense view of conscious subjects, like way further than panpsychism. And also a property so ubiquitous can't in itself have any ethical significance. And we should think it's like makes a difference to ethics. And I agree. But I want to respond that I don't think panpsychism does imply universalism at all. So first of all, it's not the default view among panpsychists. Philip Goff has defended it. Luke Roloffs, who might be with us on Zoom, has defended it. But Goff has abandoned it. So, you know, if you want to think in terms of numbers, which you might maybe shouldn't do, it's not really strongly represented, even though it's not indefensible, of course. And then Gil Strawson, Miriam Bahari, and myself, to mention some, have at least argued strongly against it. So it's not like accepted. It's the most reasonable view. And there are a lot of candidate correlates of mental combination, if we just ask the when, where is their combination question, that are not universal and quite elegant. And my favorite that I want to suggest is maximal integrated information, or maximal phi. So this, according to Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory, this is the correlate of consciousness. So yeah, very briefly, like integrated information is a kind of structural property. It measures how much a system determines its own, causally determines its own future and past state, as opposed to being determined by the environment, and how much this depends on the interconnectivity of the parts. So high integrated information is about being highly interconnected internally. And if you have more integrated information than any overlapping systems, so if you have more integrated information than any of your own parts, or any bigger system that you are part of. So I have to have more integrated information in my brain than, for instance, if you think of the whole room or the whole group of people. If you have maximal integrated information, then you are conscious, or you have unified consciousness, otherwise not. So this theory has, at least, you know, all this is very controversial, but it has both empirical alleged support and some independent philosophical support. So philosophical support, apart from the arguments for the kind of panpsychism I talked about. And if you think this is the correlate of combination, well, first of all, you get maximal phi, or you find phi kind of everywhere in nature. Even the quark has, or a proton or a neutron has a tiny bit of phi. So if that's not part of a larger system with higher phi, then it will be conscious. But when a particle becomes part of a system with even higher phi, such as a brain, there will be a new combination and a new unified consciousness. So this is already a kind of panpsychist theory, and it also has this principle of when there's combination, when there's maximal integrated information. You could also take almost any thing that you might think is typically a correlate of human consciousness, and you might generalize a little bit, and you could add this maximality or minimality criterion. So you can say, oh, the largest global workspace, the largest thing that's a global workspace, but doesn't, it's sort of larger than any of the smaller global workspaces contained within it. Or if you have the recurrent processing theory of consciousness, you can say, oh, anything that is the largest recurrent network. If you have a smaller recurrent network within that, then that doesn't count. So the idea here is that maximal properties are not universal. Like not everything can be a maximum, and maximal properties can't even overlap, like by definition. So if you accept that maximal integrated information or maximal whatever really is sort of the correlate of combination, then you avoid universalism very elegantly. So that's the way I think panpsychists could go to avoid this objection. I don't think it's clear at all that you're kind of forced towards universalism, and that's clearly the most elegant view. Did we start like, okay, fine, okay, I can do that. Okay, so then back to like how we can move the debate in support of realism. So the first thing, as I said, was a solution to the exclusion problem. The problem of how consciousness can be causally relevant, assuming physical causal closure. Panpsychism has the following answer. Consciousness is the intrinsic nature of the physical world. Why does the physical world need an intrinsic nature? Why can't it be pure structure? Well, my favorite argument here is that without, if the physical world were purely structural, didn't have an intrinsic nature, then the physical world would be indistinguishable from an abstract mathematical object with the same structure. You could just like conceive of a mathematical object that has the exact same structure as the physical world and say, there will be no difference between that and the physical world because, you know, by definition, they're structurally identical. And obviously there's a huge difference between the physical world and the mathematical object. And that difference could only be that the physical world is a structure of something with non-structural intrinsic properties. So if this is correct and consciousness plays the role of the intrinsic nature of the physical world, then it really plays the role of granting concrete existence as opposed to this just like abstract mathematical existence to the physical world. So in the words, often quoted words of Stephen Hawking, consciousness literally breathes fire into the equations of physics. It's what makes for their, universe, for the equations of physics, something for them to describe. So very significant role for consciousness there. Okay, great. We've solved the main problem of realism. Why even consider illusionism? Well, there's a combination problem, which, we didn't quite solve by what I said, which says that only micro consciousness is really granted the causal role according to that argument. What about our own macro consciousness? But then there's also another objection that Keith mentions in his 2016 paper. That's from Robert Howell, who claims that panpsychism only gives us like mental causation qua intrinsic, not qua phenomenal. That's what one of them should say. So what this means is that in principle, if consciousness is just like the realizer, intrinsic realizer of physical structure, it doesn't matter what kind of consciousness we put in there, as long as it's intrinsic. So right now, for instance, not right now. Yeah, okay, my experience, if I think of my leg that some of you have heard me complain about, then the intrinsic nature of that is pain, or very, very light pain, so don't worry. But, if we switch that with pleasure, or if we switch like my blue experience with red experience, that wouldn't make a difference. We could still have the same structure because all we need for structure is some intrinsic property or other. It doesn't matter what it is, right? So this particular qualities of consciousness kind of become phenomenal. So here I wanna, have to rush through this. Sorry for, I wanna come in with my phenomenal powers view that I have developed in a few papers, which basically says that phenomenal properties have causal powers, like non-human causal powers, like oomph, they bring stuff about in virtue of how they feel or their intrinsic phenomenal nature, as opposed to some external governing laws, if you have that view of causation, or external brute regularities, or in virtue of any non-phenomenal aspects that they might have. So that means that pain just makes us try at least to avoid it in virtue of feeling bad, where feeling bad is to be understood in a qualitative rather than normative or functional sense. Do not kind of trivialize this. And pleasure makes us try to pursue or sustain it in virtue of feeling good, again, in a qualitative sense. I think this is compatible with empirical data. Nobody pursues pain and avoids pleasure in the absence of any interfering motive. So you can pursue or endure pain because you think it will lead to less pain in the future, or because you think it would lead to greater pleasure, but not for the sake of the pain itself, if you only had the pain. At least I don't think we have any clear cases of that. What about masochism? Don't masochists pursue pain for their own sake? No, I think masochists pursue pain for the sake of the accompanying pleasure, the thrill that comes along with the pain. That's the real motivation, not the pain in itself. No counterexamples to this, no clear ones. And I think you can make a conceivability argument. It might be conceivable that pain makes us pursue it or do something else than avoid it in virtue of some external law. For instance, I can imagine a world where causation is grounded in these like external laws that have their own existence, and they happen to be such that pain has very different effect than they have in our world. But if I assume that pain kind of has causal powers in virtue of itself alone, and how itself is like it's characterized by its phenomenal nature, then I just don't think it's conceivable that will make us pursue it in virtue of how it feels, because the feeling of pain just is intrinsically repulsive in a qualitative sense. So if you have causal powers in virtue of that quality, then it has to be a repulsive power. I think that is inconceivable that it's something else. So at least pain has this like capacity that we have a strong grasp of to necessitate its effects in virtue of how it feels. If we assume we're not in this like governing laws world. So you can take this view, you can combine it with panpsychism, you can get phenomenal powers panpsychism. All causal powers are grounded in phenomenal properties, not just like my power to do something to avoid pain. Every causal power is just like kind of grounded in equality, like the way repulsive power is grounded in my pain. And if that's the case, then phenomenal properties don't just fill in physical structure in virtue of being intrinsic, they also explain why we have this structure and not some other kind. So if I swapped pleasure with pain, you would get a different causal structure. And then you get, efficacy qua phenomenal, not qua intrinsic only in panpsychism. So you get a much more robust solution to the exclusion problem if you think the one we have is not robust enough. Might also help with consciousness science. If behavior, it follows from this view that if behavior is produced by a conscious state, it must be produced by one that sort of intelligently motivates it. So then you get a sort of a connection between consciousness and experience and its quality and publicly observable properties such as behavior. Keith mentioned this in a footnote. It claims to have some objections, which I understand. One objection is that at least it doesn't give you a one-to-one correlation, because there are many different experiences that could cause the same behavior. And in a lot of cases, we can't really imagine what the experience would be, because we can only imagine stuff that we ourselves have experienced. But it will give you at least something to go on. Okay, so that was what I had to say. Here's my summary. We seem to have a stalemate between realism and illusionism. There's three things I consider that you might think should move the realist towards illusionism. Solution to the illusion problem? I don't think so, because this is already implied by physical causal closure. Doesn't create a lot of problems we didn't already have. Realism undermines consciousness science. Not any consciousness science worth having for the realist. Panpsychism implies universalism. No, that can be easily avoided by assuming, for instance, maximal phi or maximal whatever as a possible correlate. What should move the illusionist? Solution to the exclusion problem. Here I suggest panpsychism and the phenomenal powers view, and a solution to the combination problem, which I haven't talked about, but at least I've tried to show that you don't need to accept universalism to have a solution to the combination problem. All right, thank you very much.